All right, it's 11:01. So welcome everybody, welcome panel, welcome participants, audience. Hi, Noel. Welcome to this Mad in America conversation about perceptions of madness in the time of the COVID virus and how it's being engaged with and what we're learning. And I'm sure that since John Reed and Peter Kinderman were the people who dreamed up this conversation, they can put it better than I can why we're here.
And John, do you want to?
Yeah, okay. I'll be brief because I'm going to disappear shortly and just be in the chat room. I'm not part of the panel. So hi everyone. I'm John from England, and just this. I'm a professor of clinical psychology at the University of East London. Blah blah blah. But just how it got started, a bunch of us in England, sort of professionals, researchers, service users, experts by experience, were worried about how the pandemic would be, how emotional reactions to the pandemic could be misinterpreted as signs of mental illness and disorder, and that could then lead to, on top of the grief and loss and fear that we're all experiencing, the unnecessary additional burden of thinking that you're mad or got an illness, and could also lead to unnecessary prescribing, which we're already seeing some anecdotal evidence of. So we decided to try, amongst other things, trying to get into British media, to get something going more internationally. And that's where Kermit and all these other wonderful people got involved. So it'll be a lovely hour and a half, I think. It's great to be with you all.
Yeah, and I guess we thought it was slightly more complex and slightly more dynamic and slightly more interactive than just writing a piece for a newspaper or writing a blog. So out of the conversation will come a more relevant and deep understanding of what we're talking about. There's a lot of potential for misunderstanding, and so you can resolve some of those issues in conversation, we thought.
Good, thank you. Now, with the we're asking our panelists to all introduce themselves.
Should I jump in, Kermit?
Yes, I was about to invite you, Laura.
Hi, everyone. My name is Laura Delano. I'm based in Connecticut in the US. It's an honor to be here with the rest of my fellow panelists and with all of the attendees, and thanks to Mad America for pulling this together. I run an organization called Inner Compass Initiative based here in the US. Our mission is to help people make more informed choices about psychiatric drugs and diagnoses and really the whole mental health system. And our main focus at this stage is to help people get informed about psychiatric drug tapering. So we have a comprehensive online hub called the Withdrawal Project, where you can find freely available information such as a self-directed manual where you can teach yourself how to taper. We have a connecting platform. You can find other people who are in the process of coming off. We have resources for coping with withdrawal symptoms, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm, yeah, it's in my estimation, these resources are a basic right, should be a basic right to all people on psychiatric drugs, people off, because none of us, myself included, are making informed choices about these drugs, and it's important that we get access to the information that we need in order to do so. So I'm looking forward to being a part of today's conversation, and yeah, thank you for having me.
My name is Cathy Flaherty. I'm the Executive Director of Connecticut Legal Rights Project. Like Laura, I too am based in Connecticut in the United States. I'm also an expert by experience. I'm a person with a lived history of being committed to a psychiatric hospital. My first year of law school, several voluntary admissions, but at this point, getting to run a legal aid organization that represents low-income people living with mental health conditions, including people who are in our state-operated psychiatric facilities in Connecticut. So what I'll be talking about later is a complaint that we filed in federal court on behalf of several of our clients to try to help keep them safe. I also just want to note for the record that concerns have been raised about accessibility of this in terms of live captioning or the lack thereof, and ASL or BSL interpretation. So I'm hoping that that will be something we'll be able to improve in future conversations so that we can make this information available to more people everywhere.
My name is Carina Håkansson. I'm from Sweden. I'm a psychotherapist, doctor in psychology, and I was one of the founders for International Institute for Psychiatric Drug Withdrawal. That's fine for now.
Okay, hi, I'm Noel Hunter. I'm a clinical psychologist in New York City in the United States. This is one of the worst places to be right now, and also one of the best in an ironic sort of way. I'm going to apologize in advance. I cannot stay for the whole thing because I do have a full work day, and I have back-to-back sessions and have to hop on a session at 2 o'clock. I'm coming to you mostly, I think, talking a bit about my experience with COVID and the fact that as a former psychiatric survivor myself, the parallels that I've experienced trying to navigate the medical system and the dismissiveness and how, you know, the rigidity with which doctors tend to approach most things. And if something doesn't fit on a checklist, then you must either be making it up, or it must be anxiety, or you need to, or you're a waste of time, or they get upset with you or dismissive. And just how much this has been going on for people who are really, really sick and with a really, really frightening illness that people don't understand right now. And that's it.
Hello, my name is Justin Karter. I'm the Science News, Research News editor for Mad in America, also a doctoral candidate in counseling psychology at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. So I'm also coming from the northeast of the US today. I'm here to talk about some of the risks of excessive medicalization using diagnostic tools, especially during this pandemic, particularly new diagnostic categories like prolonged grief disorder, the promotion of screening instruments in primary care, and the profusion of mental health applications that attempt to screen and predict mental health issues as well.
Hi everybody, so my name is Peter Kinderman. I'm a professor of clinical psychology at the University of Liverpool in the UK, and I have had my fingers in many pies over the years. So I used to be president of the British Psychological Society. I'm still involved in the Council for Evidence-Based Psychiatry. I'm part of the team that looks after MAD in the UK, and I'm also connected with the Drop the Disorder for Everyone events in the UK. And I've been asked to comment that if you're interested in artistic events surrounding the idea of mental health and what it means, we have a poetry event tomorrow night from 6 p.m. I think, but check out the Disorder for Everyone links and you can find out about that. I guess my background is I'm a clinical psychologist, and that's where I come from. My perspective is that I've campaigned for many years really that I think we would all do a lot better if we were to stop talking about our psychological and social difficulties in terms of the metaphor of illness and disease and pathology. And so, especially in the time of a COVID pandemic, when we're faced with major challenges as a society, I really am concerned about what will happen if we start segmenting that off as a form of, or even a cause of yet more mental illness. There are dangers in going down that route, in my opinion. So that's my background, and that's my perspective.
Hi, I'm Keris Myrick, and I'm in Los Angeles. I'm my role here in Los Angeles is Chief of Peer and Allied Health Professions. for the Los Angeles County Department of Mental Health. I'm a person with lived expertise who's had multiple involuntary hospitalizations. And people may know me as serving in a lot of different roles throughout the federal level and national level. And I guess I was asked here also because of my concern around disparities for communities of color, people living on the margins, and how do we frame fear and grief in ways that are really about sort of natural reactions to this pandemic that's happening versus thinking about, is this a mental illness? Yeah, I look forward to the conversation with everybody. And sorry about the background noise. I can't find a place in my home that isn't the hammering outside, so I apologize.
So with your all permission, this is a slight change from, well, I'm just going to start, if it's okay with you all, I'd like to invite Noel. First, because you're going to leave early, but also what you mentioned, the ways that having dealt with a COVID infection, the ways that sort of reminded you of your experience in the psychiatric system. Could you say more about that?
Sure. I think that there's many ways, and it's just an interesting sort of collision of things. And I think, you know, a lot of the information we're getting out, people obviously around the world, everybody's scrambling to try to understand this thing, and it's mutating as they're trying to understand it. And when they understand one thing, it changes to another. And I have a lot of respect for the people who are trying to get a hold of this and to put information out to the public and that kind of thing. However, I think when it comes to many doctors, and when it comes to the medical system in general, the mental health system simply being a part of that, I think the way people are trained in this day and age with the medical model, the overarching medical model period, is that you know, doctors are taught to not question. They're not really taught to think for themselves. They're not really taught to listen to their patients. They're not really taught to sit and take the time and empathize. Instead, they're taught to go down a checklist, and they're taught to quickly come up with a drug that's going to go with whatever that checklist points them to. And that's not really working with this particular situation in many ways, for many reasons. And so I think that what's happening across the board is, you know, we're hearing a very reductionistic view of what this is: cough, fever, cough, fever, cough, fever, when in fact only about 60% of people even have those experiences in the first place. And it's way more complicated than that. And in order to be able to understand what's happening for somebody, you have to be able to listen and take a holistic view rather than a couple of reductionistic checkpoints. And I think I feel very lucky being here in New York City, because we are seeing, sadly, thousands upon thousands of people a day who are being inflicted with this and coming to the ERs. And most of the doctors I've seen have said everything that I've experienced is exactly what they're hearing constantly. But at the same time, they don't know how to sit and say, I don't know. And so what they do say is, well, there's nothing we can do for you, but we can prescribe you Xanax. There's, you know, yes, your entire body is out of whack. Yes, you feel you could have a heart attack at any moment. Yes, I'm monitoring you for potential heart failure, but your anxiety is a problem. So let's get your anxiety under control. And it's so invalidating and so insulting. And especially if I acknowledge that I've ever had any experience in the mental health system in the past, which I avoid at all costs telling anybody, because then it's very easy to be like, see, yep, see, it's just anxiety. And again, I haven't really had too much of that. However, when I finally joined some online support groups where people are by the hundreds describing exactly the same type of stuff I'm experiencing, it is across the board constantly. People just being dismissed as anxious, dismissed as mentally ill. And it's just, and everybody's being put on psych drugs, not even just because of the sadness and anxiety of what's happening in the world, but because when you feel that your entire body is under assault, guess what? That's really scary. When you know that you could die at any second, it's super scary. And then to be told, well, you probably should be on a psych drug in response to that, I don't even have the words for it. But then similar to the psychiatric system, where people are finding help is through peer support. And that's where people actually can listen to people, and that's where people are actually understanding one another. Yeah, that's my spiel, I guess.
I mean, I'm happy to kind of follow up on Noel, because I wasn't sure if I should wait for Kermit to call on somebody, but I too have lived through my own bout with COVID. But one of the concerns that I have had from the beginning is at least my primary care physician listened to me, and she actually did express a lot of the not knowing, because nobody knows, because they're still learning. And I think that's a reflection on her. But the other thing that I have seen and observed directly with people is that invalidation that Noel was talking about. I have clients that I've worked with who complain about symptoms, and they are the same symptoms that I have had. But as a lawyer, if a medical professional says in their judgment that whatever is happening is not real, it really constricts our ability as lawyers to do something about that. And that's been incredibly frustrating emotionally to watch happen to friends of mine. And it's been a real challenge these last couple of months.
I just, thanks for that. I've been lucky enough so far to avoid the virus, but I thought there was something very interesting in the two sorts of invalidation that you talked about. And I think that this is, I think it would be morally wrong for us to talk about the COVID pandemic as some sort of learning example or even an opportunity. I think it's just terrible. But I think that it does illustrate some of the things that we're talking about. And there's a two-phase of invalidation here. The first is an invalidation that happens when our understandable emotions are labeled as symptoms of an illness. And then the invalidation on the other side, which if they don't meet the criteria for an illness, they're just normal. And that's invalidating too. So if I'm scared because I or my partner might get a life-threatening illness, and that's simply regarded as normal and therefore nothing to do with the mental health system, that's invalidating. If I have to meet the criteria for coronaphobia before I meet the criteria to help, that's invalidating too. It's as if you can't get the validation and support you need, whichever way it cuts. So if you're just one of the vast majority of people who find this situation terrifying and disrupting, and our lives will be adversely affected by the economic consequences, just to be told that's normal is invalidating. To be told that the answer is through psychiatric diagnosis and medication, that's invalidating too. And it's infuriating that, in a sense, the system is in danger of adopting a way of thinking about our emotional responses which manages to invalidate everybody. And like I say, instead, maybe we should just understand that this is how human beings respond to tragedies and get on with the business of helping each other.
Yeah, I just want to say real quick that I unfortunately I've also been involved with a cardiologist, which is a super terrifying thing to have to deal with as a healthy younger person. But this particular cardiologist was on the phone with me on a daily basis, and that 10-minute phone check-in was all I needed to feel like I'm going to be okay. A 10-minute phone check-in. I didn't need Xanax. I didn't need somebody telling me I'm mentally ill. I didn't need somebody, dismissing me or some diagnosis or that. Just somebody to sit there and talk to me for 10 minutes and say, yep, your fear is normal. And I don't know if it's going to be okay, but I'm going to be here checking on you. If we, that's it. How powerful that can be, and what a shame that we don't have that widespread.
And I think for me, it's just one of the challenges. I think for our clients and for me personally, because it's one thing for all of us, you know, who don't come from multiply marginalized backgrounds. When we're getting disrespected, just like the whole systemic racism, ableism that's in the entire medical system, and especially within psychiatry. And that's why really on behalf of our clients, we felt that the only thing that we could do in terms of our state operated psychiatric hospitals was bring them to federal court, because it just seemed like the system was prepared to continue doing business as usual, and business as usual in inpatient psych, bringing people into congregate care facilities, doing restraints and seclusion, doing involuntary medication, not letting people out, was putting people at risk of dying. And unfortunately in Connecticut, we have, that happened last week. So, you know, at this point, I'm going to be quiet for a while, but I wanted to make sure that I made that point.
I think I'd like to follow up with some of the things that, you know, you all have been saying, and sort of my feeling of, you know, now the world knows what it's like to be us, meaning people who have lived through these experiences. And I find myself saying, welcome to our world, like, you know, where you been? And a lot of the things that even people have been asking for sometimes for support, especially those who are unhoused, suddenly could, bam, be done. Meaning, you know, in Los Angeles County, for example, many of people who have been unhoused and looking for shelter and not being able to access not temporary shelter, but more permanent, sustainable shelter, suddenly were able to get the resources and pull that together. And I asked myself, but why couldn't we do that before? You know, why does it take this to actually move towards that? Secondarily, as far as, you know, people identifying, you know, I think this is nationally, you know, it was said, yes, if you have a cough or a fever, stay home, don't show up until the hospital until, or don't show up somewhere until, also feels very much like what it's like when you're having a mental distress and you're trying to get help. It's always like, well, no, we're not going to see you until, you know, it's time for quote unquote some kind of involuntary means of supporting someone. So sometimes, you know, this period has felt very familiar in many ways and very unfamiliar in other ways. I think for our communities of color, what we're seeing in LA and of course across the nation is the disparities. And yes, it can hit everybody equally. It is not discriminating. Let's be clear about that. But what is happening, however, is, for example, the African American community, of which we only make up about 8%, our contraction rate and death rate is twice that of the ratio of the population, which says, okay, something's going on there that we need to address, and in different ways than we would or have been able to address historic and systematic and institutional racism. And this is, I think, where our peers sometimes have not been adequately deployed. According to, like SAMHSA's Disaster Technical Assistance Center, there are two things that are essential. And we're talking about what's essential. So if it's essential, everything else is like, that's not essential. Yeah, we're not going to worry about that, right? So essential is making sure you don't get and pass the disease. Okay, that is essential. But what they also say is essential is social connection. So how do you do this in a time of physical distancing or social, what do we call it? Social distancing. So, you know, peers, again, the work that we do is also around sitting with people, sitting through the struggles, discomfort, fear, the unknown. All of those things are things that we do, but we can also do the other essential practice of helping people be socially connected in ways that are safe. That is primary. And you know, Dr. Mark Salzer from Temple University Collaborative on Community Inclusion has, I think, beautifully said that community inclusion is a medical necessity. I don't like to zero things down to it's a medical or not, but if that is what helps people understand the power of social connection, then maybe that is sometimes the language that we have to use.
I think it's interesting how quickly this conversation has embraced issues, I guess, of politics, really, about social injustice, about equity, especially people of colour, people from BAME backgrounds are being overrepresented in the mortality statistics here and in the US. And I think across Europe, although Europe, of course, has got much lower death rates than the rest of us, at least some countries in Europe. And I think it's political. I think also one of the things I wanted to bring up, and I'm sorry if it touches on issues of party politics, but I wanted to bring up the issue that it is convenient if there is a coming together, a synchrony between the traditional illness-based models of mental health, where people meet the criteria for a disorder and then get treated within the health services of one kind or another for that disorder, and hopefully they receive the care that they need. There's a synchrony between that model and a neoliberal capitalist model of the economy that suggests that when we are faced with an enormous global impact on our way of life and on the economic functioning of citizens, that the way to deal with it is not to change anything, not to reform, not to protect people against job losses, not to protect people against income loss, not to protect people against predatory landlords or employers, but instead to medicate people who happen to suffer. One of the things that I think is significant is that, at least in my judgment, probably the most significant mental health impact of the coronavirus pandemic will be the economic disaster that follows. There's also huge potential in the economic chaos that follows of great inequality. We see politicians arguing that minimum wage requirements and requirements on following employment law should be relaxed in order to allow people back into the market. So there's a huge danger, not only that the economy will suffer and that will have enormous consequences for citizens' mental health, but that economic and social damage will be disproportionate. In that context, to see people who are suffering because of the social damage, the economic damage, and because our politicians fail to take the economic and political decisions that will keep us safe, I think you've got a nasty synchrony between the illness metaphor of suffering and the economic politics of neoliberalism, and that really bothers me at all. And just to nail my colours on the mast, if we were, as I think we should, to see this as a social and economic crisis consequent upon a viral pandemic, and not as a mental health pandemic following a medical pandemic, if we were to see it as a social and economic crisis, I think we would make very different decisions about how we respond. I hope that's going to happen, but I think that one of the reasons for taking part in this is I think we need to make sure that our fellow citizens and our politicians realize what direction they need to travel in.
I don't know if this fits what I want to say, but for once, when I'm listening, I'm feeling a bit proud of Sweden. I usually am not very proud, but I do not very much recognize what you say with the things to try or to, how can I say, psychiatry has had still so far a very laid back position in Sweden. I don't recognize the things we have talked about so far. And also for what you said, Peter, pretty early on, the government decided to make it easy for everyone to stay at home, for instance, the first day, and that you don't have to go to your work just because you don't have money if you don't do it, and a lot of actually social actions has taken place here in our country the last weeks, which is very hopeful. I think we are many who share that opinion. Yeah, I just wanted to say that.
If I could pivot the conversation a little here to touch on a population of people we haven't yet explicitly spoken about, so many of my fellows in the withdrawal community, the psychiatric drug withdrawal community, are living in, this double peril of the peril we all are seeing and hearing every day, but also just at this deeper level, the tenuousness of like recognizing how tenuous their relationship to their prescriptions could be, basically. I haven't connected with that many people who have actually not been able to get access to their prescriptions. I've heard a few stories, but the simple fact that, with the broader political situation, with the pandemic, it makes the possibility that people's access to the drugs that they're already on could go away overnight, potentially, which would have huge consequences, as many of us know. When you've taken psychiatric drugs for an extended period of time, it can be incredibly hard to get off of them. And so it's been interesting to see in the withdrawal community just the complexity of the fear people have, because there's the fear we all have of the, just the mysteries of this virus that Noel and Kathy spoke about in their own personal experience. There's the fear of like, what if I lose access to my drugs and it forces me into cold turkey withdrawal and everything falls apart? And then there's also the fear of, for so many of us who were these deep believers in conventional mental health care, conventional medicine even, and who ended up feeling harmed. A lot of us have fears about, I've heard people say, if I got COVID, I would rather stay at home than actually have to go back into a hospital because of the trauma that happened to me there. And so I think there's so much happening in our community online and, in our various online groups at this point, and our voices don't get out that far because we're such a hidden population. But the fact that there are so many millions of people on these drugs, 1 in 5 Americans, latest number, and overnight, millions of people could potentially be in withdrawal. I think we need to also be having a conversation about the role that drugs play in this. And so we have all these people who are getting new diagnoses, as we're all saying, the problems of people who are being pathologized for having anxiety and fear. And there's just maybe starting these drugs. We of course need to be reaching them to help them get better information so that they can really think through, is this the choice I want to make? Do I really want to start this benzodiazepine prescription right now? It may end up being the choice they want to make. Maybe they have no support system. They have no access to fresh air. The stress of losing their job is so profound that for them, that Xanax is worth the risk, but they have the right to at least know the risks. There are all those people, but then what about all the people who are already on these drugs? When I think about how, what that could do, how that could disrupt our society, were supply chains to be cut off, even for just one type of drug, like, Prozac, the consequences would be profound. So I feel like that's also something for us to all be thinking about and grappling with together and talking about.
No, I think Laura's exactly right, because it's a concern that I've seen on many sides, not just supply chain disruption, but people losing access to health insurance. Because unlike what Carina said, in terms of Sweden and the countries that made it safe and possible for people to stay home and stay safe, millions of people in the United States lost their jobs, and that health insurance that we all supposedly love that comes through our employers, people lost left and right. And without access to insurance, I mean, this discussion can go so many different ways, but parts of the conversation just really aren't being had, which was why I was so delighted that Mad in America decided to have this conversation. And I apologize for not starting with my name. It's one of the things that I actually said Accessibility of Zoom calls increases when we say who we are when we're talking. And so this is Kathy for those people who can't see the screen. It's frustrating because I think the challenge we also have for some of us advocates who are trying to do the work to make sure that people can have access to healthcare, we don't always do a great job as lawyers communicating to the community about the work that's being done. So the fact that this conversation allows me to communicate with all of you about some of the things that we're doing is really very much appreciated. So thank you.
I just wanted to respond to something that Laura said. Well, two things that Laura said. One, just quickly, I am in 2 different support groups for people who are having long, ongoing, never-ending symptoms of COVID. And in one of these groups, there was somebody posted up there that she had been given, I think, Xanax or something like that, and was wondering how many other people had been diagnosed with anxiety in the process of trying to get help for COVID. And 60 people responded on a Facebook random group, right? This is 60 people responded, and I read through the comments. People were being prescribed antipsychotics. Seroquel was one of the #1 things people were being prescribed because they're going to the hospital to get help for chest pain. They're being prescribed Zoloft. They're being prescribed Wellbutrin. These are drugs that aren't, Xanax is one thing. At least you can take that intermittently. There are ways to take it that you're not necessarily going to be hooked on it, but these other drugs are daily drugs. Antipsychotics, people are being, anyways, it's disgusting. But then the second piece, which I'm seeing random comments coming up from people out there, is this whole trauma-informed idea, right? And I'm a clinical psychologist, and I can tell you that I go in to see the doctor, and that's one of the first things I say, because I'm so scared to be in there. And I tend to get scared talking to doctors for my own reasons within psychiatry and various other things, but I also just simply get intimidated by somebody acting arrogant and dismissive towards me. That tends to shut me down. And when you get a 15-minute check and they're just trying to quickly get, what is wrong with you? What is wrong with you? What is wrong with you? Just tell me what's wrong with you, right? That's the attitude that they come in with. Me personally, I start to freeze. And then what happens? If I'm frozen, I can't describe what in the world I'm experiencing. And if I can't describe what in the world I'm experiencing, it's so much easier then for the person to turn around and say, clearly you're just anxious. Clearly it's just this. Clearly it's just this. And we are re-traumatizing people and newly traumatizing people just simply by the fact, not just labeling people as you're having a mental illness because you're scared or you're experiencing normal grief, but simply by the way doctors tend to approach people in these very fast pace, and people are scared, and then you're snapping at them and this kind of thing, and you're shutting them down further, and you're getting more invalidated, and it's this cycle of trauma being repeated on so many levels.
Could
But, no, I do you want to go, Peter?
No, you go.
No, I was just, no, I hesitate because I really don't want to sound like an optimistic blue. I mean, as if everything here is good, because of course it's not. But what is good, I think, and what I have been waiting for a couple of decades is actually that now we have a conversation both between individuals but also in society as a whole, where fear and anxiety and angst is nothing that other people deal with. It's something that all of us can deal with, and there is a hope in that. I think that's what I meant. It is not so much that we pathologize these phenomena, rather the opposite. That it seems as if in this crisis, it has been very obvious that it is not possible maybe to live through these things without fear and without anxiety and without having at times very, you can say, exaggerated thoughts, but a lot of people have. So it's not just, so to speak, psychiatric patients or people connected with psychiatric symptoms or whatever we call it. And in that, I think it's a lot of hope in that. And it also makes a possibility for, at least for us here where I am, to some extent rewrite the narratives.
Well,
at least for now.
Well, I think I can pick up on it. So I'm not so hopeful from a political point of view. I'm in a country which is I hesitate to say led by an idiot, because he's an idiot, but he's not doing any leading, right? However, I think we can move on the conversation, and I think this is a good place to move on the conversation from what is bad. We've elaborated what's bad. I think we can talk a little bit, I think we have talked a little bit about how in these difficult times, various narratives and forces and self-interests can mean that the narrative of psychiatric illness can serve functions for people and can sustain ways of life that we really don't like and can be very profitable for some people, I guess. But anyway, but we could think about what the alternatives are. And I think the alternatives are, if we see this as a social and community level threat, then the answer is we need to come together socially and as communities to support each other in response to the threats. Somebody was writing in the UK, a social psychologist, about how it's one of the reasons why human beings have been so productive at spreading our species across the globe is because quintessentially we come together as a tribe, as a community, as a group, as a family, as a hunter-gatherer group, as a community when there's external threats. We couldn't bring up our children at all if we didn't rely on other people to help us with the communal processes of growing. So it is in our DNA, literally, that, well, it's not literally, what's literally in our DNA is the code for proteins, but it's in our evolutionary history that we as a community come together to protect each other at times of threat. And actually, in times of warfare and in times of pandemic, communities have done that historically. What we have to do now is come together as towns, as villages, as communities of interest, and as geographical communities to support those people who are vulnerable, to look after our children, to rebuild the social structures that we've got. So it's not that we're just knocking biomedical psychiatry in the wake of COVID. What we're saying is that the human and communal and compassionate responses to trauma that we're talking about actually offer us a route map back to a functioning economy and a functioning society when we're faced with these sorts of traumas. So I think there is some hope in this, as long as we don't isolate individuals who are suffering, as long as we don't re-traumatize people who have been traumatized, and as long as we don't pick on the vulnerable and see them as exploitable in these times. If we come together, we can form a way out of this. But I think it means forming community groups. I think it means supporting, in political terms, it means supporting the mayors and the local councils and the villages and the city councils and the communities and the governors of organizations to come together to support what we as citizens need. And not saying it's going to be business as usual and the people who suffer can go and see their psychiatrist. So we've got a vision for the future as well.
I wanted to jump in about these competing narratives. It's something that we talk about regularly at Mad in America, the biomedical narrative on one hand, and these competing, more social, relational narratives on the other hand about mental distress. And to everybody's point, of course, there's individual experiences here, and people are differently affected by the COVID pandemic, depending on their position and their positionality. And to echo something Kathy spoke about earlier, there are people who can't be on this call with us right now because they're not allowed to have phones or technology in inpatient settings. And yet there is also this collective experience that we're having at the same time. And also cautious about being optimistic, like Carina said, or hopeful in these times. But this collective experience does seem to offer an opportunity for empathy, for understanding how isolation can produce feelings of distress, to understand how feeling unsafe in the world around you creates distress, to understand how political decisions, policies, access to resources, access to social services creates and amplifies people's distress. It seems very obvious for a large group of people who maybe haven't been part of this dialogue about mental health for a long time, that what they're experiencing now, the anxiety, the depression, whatever you want to label it, the distress, is connected to all these external social communal forces. And it seems like it is an opportunity to relate that experience and bring people into this conversation about rethinking how we conceptualize mental health beyond the individual. And of course, that it seems that social relational perspective on where our mental distress comes from is so obvious at this point that there are going to be tools, there are going to be competing discourses that attempt to translate this social distress back into individual terms. And some of those tools are diagnosis. We have the American Psychiatric Association proposal for adding prolonged grief disorder to the DSM at the moment, which seems particularly problematic at a time when people aren't able to grieve in the ways that their traditions suggest, in the ways that they want to for their loved ones. We have the push to screen adults and now adolescents and children for anxiety and depression in primary care, which screening instruments really can't account for the social and environmental changes that lead to people's distress going up. They just kind of, yes, no, you meet criteria. And then we have the profusion of telehealth and mental health apps that are designed to predict whether or not people are experiencing depression or anxiety based upon how they behave on their phones. And at Med in America, we did Peter Simons wrote about MindStrong, which is a big one of these apps that's being developed by Tom Insel, the former head of the National Institute of Mental Health. So I think we have this opportunity here. It's very clear to people that what they're experiencing, that these experiences of distress are connected to all these external and social and relational forces. And yet on the other hand, we have these threats that attempt to translate that information back into individual and medical terms.
I'd like to jump in just for a moment. First, to several people that have asked if this will be available afterwards. It will. The recording will be available on YouTube. I'd like to, because Noel, there's a couple of questions I'd like to put into the mix here. And first among them, because Noel is leaving soon, there's a question about how to, I'll just read it. I have COVID with, this is from Rachel Flanagan, by the way. She gave permission to use her name. I had COVID with severe hypoxia, was scared to interact with medical services, but was believed and received good care. But many of my friends in the peer support community, I'm a Hearing Voices facilitator and organizer, have been confronting me with COVID denials conspiracy theories. Having lost a lot of my support system when I needed it and don't have the energy to engage in debates, please address how we can address COVID denial in the peer-supported community. I didn't mean to put you on the spot, Noel, but I picked that question. I wanted to hear your answer before you go.
Well, I think that what everybody's sort of talking about is I would fully agree with, and that is being able to come together in a shared experience as a community, and to be able to share in the feelings of grief rather than find the answers. People are very scared right now. Certainly there is truth to the fact that anxiety is a part of this and it's normal, and to get into debates of what's real and what isn't, and how to fix something, and how to how to fix our terrible medical system in the US. I mean, it's the worst in the world, at least in the Western world. None of us are going to come up with those answers, but there is something very special in being able to share in the fear, to share in the grief, to share in the unknowns, even though it's uncomfortable. guess that would be my answer. I just want to also throw out there, I do have to get off now, and I'm sad that I'm going to miss probably a more productive rest of this conversation where we're coming up with some more solutions rather than just talking about what the problems are. But I did want to throw out there when Justin mentioned the American Psychiatric Association, the American Psychological Association, the other APA, I get daily emails from them, about how we can help with the mental health crisis, about how we can help all the poor souls out there who are suffering right now. And it isn't about coming together as a community. It's about basically how we can sell our services. It's a marketing email, essentially couched in empathy, that I get on a daily basis. That basically, I mean, if you read between the lines, is saying, hey, here's a cash cow. How do we cash in on this and make the most of it? And I hope you all enjoy talking about that later. Thank you for having me here. I do have to go. Bye.
I don't know if I'm the right person to talk about COVID denial, but I have seen, I mean, obviously the people that I interact with, especially on social media, come from all spectrums. It is interesting that some of the people that I share an awful lot of fellow feeling with when it comes to issues of mental health, two of them, I think probably only two, but I can name two people. I won't, but I could name two people who seem to be supporters of that orange-skinned weirdo that you've got in the White House at the moment, and quite why somebody who'd share my views on psychological well-being should support somebody who's clearly incapable of high office slightly defeats me, but you know, we meet all sorts of people in this life. And part of what's happening in I think in the field of mental health is an awful lot of people who have approached authorities in good faith have been harmed. People have been lied to about the reasons why they've got distress. They're told they've got something wrong with their brain, and there literally is no evidence for that. People have found that their experiences have been denied by medical practitioners and by psychologists and by supposedly applied scientists. People have been told that the medication that they take has wonderful positive effects and no harmful. People have been lied to, right? So I don't think it's surprising that in that context, while our evil lying politicians are also managing the truth and falsehood of political statements with no bearing on facts, but on the bearing of what is in their best interest to manipulate the population, I think it's not at all surprising. I fear for it, but it's not at all surprising that some of the people who've suffered at the hands of our industrialized mental health care system also doubt the stories that they're being told now about coronavirus, about vaccines, about the wisdom or otherwise of injecting bleach. Of course, people are going to doubt those statements, and you know, I understand that. I don't think they're right. I think some of the fear stories about the coronavirus, about the lethality of the virus, about the wisdom of lockdown and so forth, I think are either foolish or have been inserted into the narrative for political reasons. One of the things I think is that what we should do on this side of the discussion about mental health is to be clear that we also are guided by logic and data and science. I mean, one of the reasons why I campaign, for instance, against the label of personality disorder and indeed against the label of schizophrenia is not because I have some mystical wish that a psychologically flavored unicorn is going to ride over the horizon and rescue us. It's because there is no science in those labels. The reasons why I'm skeptical about the use of selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors to treat a so-called disorder called major depressive disorder is because I don't believe the science backs up the diagnostic framework, and I don't believe in the supposed science behind the idea that these drugs will put right a chemical imbalance. I think they're drugs, right? And we all know about drugs. So from my point of view, the science backs up the analysis that I make of this issue. I think the science tells us that human beings come together in times of great crisis. I think the science tells us that we all feel these strong emotions and that we all get confused at times of stress. I think the science tells us that there are certain psychological and social processes that follow when we're faced with terrible situations in our lives. So I'm a scientist. And so I would suggest that when we speak to our colleagues who are skeptical about the medical science when it comes to coronavirus, is what we should say is, yeah, you know, the people who have perverted medical science towards some of the foolish messages in psychiatry have done a disservice to the medical profession and to science. Let's return to the science, let's return to the data, let's return to the evidence, and have some evidence-based approaches to COVID, as well as some evidence-based approaches to mental health. So I wouldn't say I'm a non-scientist and we should doubt science. I think we should say that the science on coronavirus is pretty damn good. Unfortunately, our colleagues in the mental health field have slipped a little bit from the high standards we should expect of them.
I'd like to jump in. At first, I didn't properly say thank you and goodbye to Noel Hunter. So to compensate for that, I'd like to mention to everybody Noel's book, Trauma and Madness in Mental Health Services. It's a great book and very relevant to the discussion today. A lot of people have been asking about what can we do, what kind of resources there are available. And so I'd like to mention Laura Delano's website, theinnercompass.org. As far as specifically the questions come up several times about withdrawal, that would be the place to go. So thanks, Laura, for that. And I'd like I'd like to mention, Kathy, you responded to somebody in the Q&A, and perhaps you'd like to bring that question into the discussion. Am I right about that?
First question. Can you, after all that?
It was, well, I'll read the question.
Okay.
And I also there's something I want to ask Carina too, but we'll get back to that. I would love to hear panelists' thoughts on anger. I think we address fear and grief a lot, but anger in the face of the realizations or reminders that those, the realizations that are happening for so many. I'm thinking of folks who have known trauma from the mental health system, who are seeing that all the talk of we're in this together, your reaction to this is valid, isn't meant for them, and they're still being pathologized. Or those who don't have that experience but are having their first realizations that much about our world isn't set up to value them. I worry that anger is still taboo.
I would love to hear Keris's answer to this question, but I do know quickly for me that I reacted very angrily at one point early in the process when I was desperately trying to get tested and was on the phone and finally got an answer after waiting on hold for 2.5 hours that the test I thought I qualified for the day before, I no longer qualified for because of the changing guidelines. And I kind of went completely off on the poor person on the other end of the phone. And that person actually did a remarkable job of reflecting that back to me, which I think is, you know, something we have to be aware of. Anger makes people really uncomfortable. A lot of people don't like and don't feel good about just being with somebody else's anger. And a lot of people have a lot of very valued and important anger that needs to be acknowledged, and denying it isn't helpful. But I'd love to hear if Keris has a different perspective than I do, because I would just love to hear from her.
Thanks. Wow, I've just sort of been trying to sit here listening to all of this, and then when I got to the anger part, I thought, yeah, got it. And how and where do we have space to be able to sit back and listen to the anger, not directed at the person. So you're talking to someone and their job is to listen and not take it personally, and to help problem solve and acknowledge the feeling as legitimate. Which hopefully that person, sounds like that person probably did. So, but I've also been a little concerned about this idea that we're in this together, that, you know, we're coming together collectively as a community, or we should, because when resources are scarce, collectivity goes out the door. And that is a scientific fact. That's a social science kind of phenomena that we cannot forget, that we might be in this together for about a half a second, but the minute you start to encroach on something that somebody needs, then suddenly the other becomes the problem. And we start to kind of grapple for those minimal resources. And generally the people in power or on top, if you will, have better access to that than people who are marginalized. So though I'm agreeing we're in this together, there's going to be a point this has happened before, I guess, if we want to look back in history, where it does become a little bit more difficult to make sure, where there's, again, sort of historical racism. We have it here. We can't ignore it. It's part of the United States. It's part of our makeup. We hear it from, and I call the person the squatter in the White House, that, it's the Chinese, is that helpful? That is not helpful. Where does that get us? But that's how some people roll. So we have to kind of figure out, what are we going to do in this space where, people's finances and, their life now is totally upended. And this is where I like to, kind of refer to or think about MLK and creative maladjustment. That actually, if we weren't maladjusted to this situation, that actually might be pathological. You know what I mean? Where you're supposed to have these feelings. And how do we reframe how the nation is talking about it? Every time I read an article or hear, even in my work, there's a mental health tsunami. Everybody's gonna have a mental illness. We're actually regurgitating or adding some kind of legitimacy to something that we can reframe it very differently, very, very differently. And I think, that is something collectively we could all do. And there's no argument about that. I think we can collectively talk about the experiences that people have. How do we shore ourselves up during this time because this is not ending tomorrow, when the doors are open and the stores are open, we're still gonna have this collective malaise, if we want to call it that, or collective trauma, if we want to call it that, that we're going to have to work through. So I want to give credence to, and I think I did this in the beginning, that many of us, this feels so familiar. And now everybody has to live in our familiarity. And the question then becomes, how do you raise up the voices of those who have been there, done that? If you want to call them a peer, if you want to call them, people who have been on the margins and mistreated and kind of had to wait for services, had to wait for treatment, didn't have insurance, don't have access to this webinar because we don't have, closed captioning or sign language or what have you. How do we raise up those experiences as this is the lived experience of everybody now? And we have some expertise to offer in order to move through and through the recovery phase and post-traumatic growth phase, if you will. Those are some of the things I have been sort of jotting down on my piece of paper to maybe throw out there for thoughts.
It's difficult as a white man, white heterosexual middle class Cambridge educated man to respond to that, because things come easy for me. When a police car drives down the street, it's me that they protect. That's the way my life goes, and I'm not particularly worried about losing my job because I'll survive. So it's difficult to respond. My immediate thoughts are, there is a huge amount of vile competition in human history, and people have exploited each other and responded to challenges by picking on people who are different. I don't know which way it will go, but I know which way it should go. So in 1930s Germany, faced with economic crisis, the German people rather unfortunately turned towards hatred and effectively competition and enslavement of others as their response to the challenges of the 1930s, and it ended terribly. But a few years later, when both Europe and America were coming out of the Second World War, in both Europe and America, they chose a more communitarian and more compassionate response. So perhaps more, more pleasantly from my perspective in Britain than in America. But in 1945, coming out of the Second World War, Britain voted to reject the right-wing politicians who had actually been quite effective during the war, and instead elected a very left-wing government that put in place welfare support, a universal healthcare system, employment protection, pensions, universal pensions, and so forth. So in 1945, the British people, in response to the collective effort to overthrow the Nazis, voted to put in place communitarian support for each other rather than competition. But it doesn't always go that way. Of course, it doesn't always go that way. It can do. I guess I don't know which way it's going to go. And we've got some appalling politicians in charge in some countries in the world. I know which way it should go. And I guess all I think is we should add our weight to arguing that if at all possible, we should move in one direction rather than the other. That's all I think. So I'm sorry if I'm being stupidly right and positive, but I know which direction we should go in, but I don't know which direction we will go in.
If I could jump in here, we were talking a lot about community and coming together, and it makes me think about the experiences I've had as I've gotten out of the mental health system and gotten off the drugs and healed. The most profoundly important experiences that have gotten me through that were these in-person, just like going to someone's house for a potluck dinner, like Dorothy, who's in the chats there, used to have these revolution dinners at her house, and we'd all come together and help each other. And when I think about, having friends stay with me when they're having a hard time, I do believe that change so often, it has to happen in all these different ways, but that at the neighborhood level, us coming together to support each other in person is so important. And yet here we are in this virus situation where overnight we have a new morality, really, new social morality about how to be a good citizen, which is to stay away from each other. And so I just find myself sitting here thinking about, if, not even when, but if and when things go back, because I have concerns that even once the virus subsides, the shifts we've all made internally about how we think about what it means to be a good citizen. And, just like when I'm out on the sidewalk and, the person and I are going away from each other, and I worry, am I too close to this person in the supermarket? Like, we have this whole new reality in how we relate with each other. And I worry what that means for those grassroots potluck dinners, the kinds of things that do get us through hard times. And that's, of course, there's so many other things besides potluck dinners that have to happen, but those are the kinds of things that in theory are simple and right at our fingertips, as long as we actually know our neighbors, which of course so many people don't. So I'm just curious to hear other panelists and even folks in the comments, like, what are your thoughts about the lasting repercussions of this psychological, spiritual even shift we've all been forced to make, where the new normal is staying away from each other is what keeps us safe. And I can't help but, I think like the whole surveillance aspect of it too, where we're surveilling ourselves, we're surveilling each other to make sure we're all doing this right. That's not to say there aren't important reasons why physical distancing is important, but I'm just worried. I think about what happened after 9/11 and the massive changes that happened so quickly in terms of our new normal that were meant to be temporary but are now permanent. I just worry as a society what's going to stay permanent from this, and that we think about that now, so that if there are there are elements of this that we don't want to stick with forever, that we don't let them become permanent too, because I think the consequences would be so profound for us interrelating as human beings with each other. Like, this is such an unprecedented thing. So yeah, I just wanted to put that out there.
This is Kathy. I think very much I've had a lot of those thoughts because I got sick just as COVID was really hitting in Connecticut, kind of before they expected people up in our area of the state to get it. And I have found myself falling into the habits that I had when I was labeled as suffering from depression. And, you know, labeled as pathological depression in terms of isolating at home, you know, going to work, then going straight home and not interacting with people. So, you know, in some ways, because I've had the privilege of having access to internet and Wi-Fi and Zoom and all these other mechanisms, I've stayed quote unquote connected to some people who I've actually talked to more in the last 2 months than I maybe have in the last 20 years. But at the same time, the first time where I was supposed to go to the supermarket, because at that point my husband was still in isolation and I felt like I had asked too many friends to drop off too much stuff at my house and I thought I could go out myself. I got in the car and I drove and I got to the parking lot and I kept driving. I did not even really stop the car at all. I just saw too many people and it looked too crowded and I honestly was afraid. And I'm like, I don't trust people and I don't like that because that's actually not who I normally am. I like to assume the best of people until they give me proof otherwise. But it's almost flipped 180 right now. You know, I don't know if people are, you know, observing the social distancing. I don't know if they're, you know, what they're doing. And that scares me. And as an employer, I don't know when I can physically go back to my office. You know, I don't know that I'm not still shedding the virus. And I just think back to mid-March, the way I felt that first day was totally a day I would have gone to work. Because even though I theoretically try to model take your sick time, it's okay to take sick time. You have it, please use it. Don't get the rest of us sick. It was a little bit of a fever and I felt kind of okay. If I had gone to work that day, I could have potentially taken my whole office out. And that lawsuit that we filed wouldn't have been happening because everybody would have been sick. So, you know, it's kind of, do you do things motivated by other people or do you do things motivated by your care and concern for other people rather than whatever personal motives you have? And I'll just be quiet again.
You know, I think this is Keris. I think this is so interesting about the difference between the motivation from keeping others safe as well as keeping yourself safe. And I have struggled with everybody buying up the toilet paper and everything in the grocery store. I didn't understand that at all. However, I've come to not see it maybe as selfishness, but as sort of, I need to figure out how to keep myself and my family safe, and glad people have the ability to buy up gazillion rolls of toilet paper. But the other thing I've been really thinking about is, you know, we say this is very novel, and yes, it is the novel coronavirus. But I would also say that there are some things about it that are not novel in this time period, and that is Ebola. And no one has ever kind of made the connection between Ebola and it being this, I don't know if it was a virus, whatever disease that, you know, was unknown, unseen. People didn't know how it was transmitted initially. And there was a lot of the same reactions that happened in West and East Africa. And the only state that I know that has taken advantage of talking to people who have been through that is Massachusetts. and why Massachusetts is doing the tracking the way that they're doing it, which is one-on-one, community member to community member, actually calling people versus digitally, like following a digital fingerprint, if you will. And I think there are lessons to be learned there that, again, we could extrapolate sort of globally around many of the things that we're talking about, the fears that we have about the other. I'm a person who everybody says, well, you can socially connect. We're doing it now, we're on Zoom. I can't see everybody. I have very, very poor vision. I also have, don't understand sometimes facial cues. So, you know, and then you put a mask on it, oh my gosh. You know, it makes it very difficult for me and probably many people to participate socially in these new ways. So how do we do that? I also think that one of the things that people who had been through the Ebola virus kind of had to think about is in their recovery resiliency response or post-traumatic growth response is sort of you know, recentering and reframing and resetting. And maybe those are some things that we could think about. I don't have the answers, by the way, this is me just pontificating. But how do we think about resetting, about work-life balance, spending time with family and friends, and what is the priority and what does that mean? At work, I would always say when people came in, even with a cough or a sniffle, would you please go home? I don't want you infecting everybody. It's more important you are healthy, your family's healthy, than coming into work. But we have this weird work thing where it's like, no, coming into work is more important than, you know, being out, that people think that they're going to be punished if they use up their sick time. That's what your sick time is for. That's what FMLA is for in the United States, right? So maybe now people will understand that, no, you don't come in when you are not feeling well. You know, you go home and you take care of yourself because we care about you. Is there a recentering, like reprioritizing what's important to us as individuals and us as communities? And this is why I love what's going on in Sweden. So thank you, Carina, for having the pride in what's going on there. I wish we kind of had the same culture that could have lent us to do some of these things more collectively. And then that our connections move to things that are at deeper levels. Those are the things that kind of came out of the Ebola experience, that among others that I think we could adopt, so that we're not talking about the tsunami of mental illness, but we're talking about the tsunami of new ways of, you know, resetting, recentering, and connecting.
Thanks. I'd like to pick up on just a little bit of a question, part of a question from Sherry Bragg. I wonder how we can combat society's prevalent view that only professionals can address mental illness. And I thought, I'd like to take a cue from that to offer a possible way to reflect on what's coming up on the end of this conversation, which is, how do we create community? This has been touched on a few different ways by various people, but I want to just take note of the fact that people on this panel have a lot of the work, the great work that they've done in the world has involved creating community around a certain way of understanding, ways of understanding what being human is, what the challenges of being human are, what they look like. I want to take note, for instance, that Carina, I experienced going to Sweden, the community that you created around the organization that you created, the Family Care Foundation, and Laura, the community that you've created with Inner Compass, and Keris, I barely could begin to scratch the surface of knowing what you've created, and Justin as well, what you've created around in the science section of Mad in America is really very much a community. So I guess I want to invite us all to reflect on what we've learned about how to create community and how that can inform the challenges that we have ahead of us. Don't all answer at once.
I was trying to be quiet. This is Kathy, but I think just quickly, one of the challenges that we faced in Connecticut, because prior to COVID, I believe we've had lots of different communities, but we relied a lot on meeting in person. And that has clearly been taken away from us right now. And we have not been able to make an entirely smooth adjustment to meeting this way, because not everybody has access to unlimited internet. Not everybody has access to smartphones. Not everybody has access to the technology. Whereas I think in some of the cross-disability alliances, we've been using the technology for a while, and we've learned how to increase the accessibility of the conversation, which I think is super important. And I hope that as this community, we can learn from some of that, because while one of the things, because somebody also put in the chat, like, why are you angry? And it kind of relates to this. So many things that disabled people have said are unreasonable requests for accommodation, are fundamental alterations of the way we do things. So therefore we can't do it, have been made available now in a way that they weren't before. Now that it is necessary for other people. So I think that's one of the things that makes me angry. And I just don't want us recreating some of those same isolations and leaving people out and left behind that we already had before any of this started.
I'll jump in to say that for the kind of community that I feel the most drawn to, that I've been spending most of my time working to cultivate, is this idea of like the neighborhood, like your local community, the people on your street, one street over, and I think there's so much power at that level of connection. And of course, in our largely alienated society pre-COVID, people were already pretty disconnected from each other. Now it's especially more so. The question has always been for me, how do you there's a great chance that on the street you live in the apartment building you live in, there's someone right down the hall or right across the road who's also on psych drugs and wanting to come off, or who's also been given a psychiatric label and they're trying to make sense of it, or who was also forcibly hospitalized, whatever it might be. But how do you figure that out? You're right next to each other, but you don't know each other exists. How do you do that? And that's what we tried to answer at Intercompass Initiative and the Withdrawal Project, by building these connect platforms that allow you can be anonymous and you share a bit of information about yourself and what your needs are, what kind of supports you're looking for, what your interests are, and then you can search and find other people based on a geographical area of distance from you. So you could theoretically say, I want to find someone within 3 miles of Hartford, Connecticut, who is also in the process of coming off psych meds, and our platform allows you to do that. And I hope, to anyone out there who hasn't yet joined, please join. We have one for anyone thinking critically about the mental health system, which is ICI Connect. If you go to theinnercompass.org, you'll see Connect on the main menu. If you're in withdrawal or you're on meds and you're thinking about coming off, if you go to withdrawal.theinnercompass.org, that's the Withdrawal Project, click Connect on the main menu. Because I do think, like Kathy's saying, right now we can't all meet in person, but we can at least begin to forge virtual connections so that when things settle down and we can start spending more time together, there have been some foundations laid. I mean, I think, to me, the biggest antidote to the mental health industry is like grassroots mutual aid neighborhood networks. And I fantasize about the day when people are so connected at that level, and they're so in touch with the power that they each have to help each other. Like, your neighbor is suicidal. The thought doesn't cross your mind, oh, I'm not a professional, I should suggest they call 911. You're tapped into your own ability to be with that person, and you invite them over for a meal or offer to do their chores so that they can rest or whatever it might be. Like that to me is the antidote. And so while we're all isolated from each other physically, now we can at least try as best we can to forge virtual connections so that when things pass, we've done some of the legwork. So, oh, and sorry, one last thing too, I'll say, we also started a weekly live stream on Facebook just to bring people together to have conversations. So if you look up Inner Compass Conversations, that's the Facebook group. So find us there if you haven't joined, and I'll shut up.
One thing I want to quickly add is that as we're, as Laura spoke to, as we're moving to connecting in ways that are going to be more frequently mediated by technology, there's really a need for us to get savvy about that, because the online environment, the app environment is being utilized by, there's a large market for our data about how we act on our phones, about, not necessarily our personal information about what we say, but behavioral data about what we open, what we don't, what times we use our phone, what kinds of phrases we use. And this data is the behavioral surplus data. I recommend Shoshana Zuboff's book, Surveillance Capitalism, that is being funneled into new ways of diagnosing mental distress called digital phenotypes, right? And so I think, absolutely these like apps, internet, Facebook Live, all of these things that we're using can be so helpful in bringing people together and connecting, and then, having offline relationships as well. But we also, I think, need legally to build in more privacy protections. We need to get more active on that front. I'd love to hear from Kathy on that. And I think we also need to get more savvy as we're building these communities, how to do that in a way that we protect our data and that we don't, kind of feed into these systems that, want to encourage us to buy certain things and perform as good neoliberal capitalist subjects, et cetera.
Only because you called me out, Justin. I do think it really is a concern in terms of privacy and surveillance and, just public health contact tracing. Generally there are reasons when the state can use its police power to do things like isolate and quarantine individuals. So if you even think about that in terms of what happens in psychiatry, all that involuntary hospitalization stuff is the same part of what they're doing supposedly to protect the public health. And yet it is so damaging, as so many of us who have been through that experience know. And, again, just lifting up the experiences of people who aren't here and can't be part of this conversation, and a conversation we weren't really having. We heard about what was happening in the nursing homes. We heard about what was happening in, the frontline general hospitals, but people completely forgot about what was happening in inpatient psych. And those units are not set up for social distancing. The whole premise of them is gathering people and not having them be distant from each other. And that's where the virus was allowed to spread. And there was no talk about the personal protective equipment for the staff. There was no talk about really testing people to see if the virus was there. And, hopefully, and I hate that it took a lawsuit to do it, but hopefully this will get some change in forward movement in addressing that. And most importantly, getting people out of those restrictive settings back into the community, which is where they have a legal right to be.
And I would add to that, this is Keris, to Kathy's, is that that is one thing that was happening in LA in various of our congregate living settings, is helping people move into spaces where they could be safe and ensuring that staff have the PPE or personal protective equipment. Yet one of the things I kind of drilled down about in what was happening is, okay, so we're helping sort of move people to community, what supports are going with them? So that it's not just, well, we've done our job, check the box, but that as you're transitioning from people from one setting to another, they have the supports to be within those settings, whatever those settings happen to be. And then secondarily, you know, when we're talking about use of technology and the data, okay, so train has left the station. If you have a phone, we're on Zoom. You think they gave Zoom free for a reason? They gave it for a reason. There's all this rich data. Everything is about data and collecting data. Your privacy out the door. If you have a phone, if you're using Facebook, if you're, train has left the station. I don't mean to be like all like doomsday-y about it, but I do think it is important. I think Justin was saying is, how do we understand this so that we're making, as Laura would say, wise choice decisions because we have the information. So yes, in California, there was an investment and, you know, we have a technology thing going on in California with some of our funding. And one of the first thing I said is that we need to have digital mental health literacy training, meaning we have to understand when you take this technology into the health or mental health space, we need to have the understanding of what does that mean so that we can make informed choices about, do I want to participate in this? Maybe I think it's cool that the phone can help me track stuff, but who owns the data? How do I get the data back? If I'm done with it, do you still hang on to the data? Can the police come and get me? I mean, we have to understand all of those implications. The other thing is on the digital divide. We cannot ignore the digital divide. It's great that we have Zoom. It's great we can text. It's great we can do all of these things through technology. We are leaving out a huge part of the population because of the limitations that are constricting people even if they have access to federal programs for people on disability and or low income. So it was very interesting to me in the US that there was federal funding and loosening of restrictions for telehealth. Yay, everybody can do it. You can use Zoom, you can use this, you can use the whatever, one half of the equation. So that's great, they fix it on the provider side. What did they do on the consumer side? So there are still people who are left out and don't have access because we didn't fix the access issue through reducing those limitations through the federal programs for the phones and the internet and the data. So I think there's always a yin and a yang, if you will. There's always a good thing about the phone. I mean, I started using technology to help me with my mental health stuff years and years and years ago, and why I became passionately interested in actually written a couple peer-reviewed articles about technology. And I do want to correct something so people are really, really clear about MindStrong. There is no such thing as digital phenotyping. It is a hypothesis. It has not been proven. So we need to be able to even language correctly what's happening. So there's this hypothesis that there's this thing called digital phenotyping that can predict mental distress. Does it? We don't know. Tom doesn't know, and he'll admit he doesn't know because it's a hypothesis. So that's how we have to be able to get super duper savvy and start to have some of these conversations. Yeah, I think that's all I'll say at the moment. Yeah.
Okay, well, we are over time. So Carina and Peter, do you have final thoughts?
No, no. I mean, it's when you said how to build a community, I was thinking that's what I have spent my whole life to try to figure out how to make it happen, how to make change happen. So unfortunately, I have no answer to that, but I do believe in this crisis, and I do believe, as I do believe in other times, that, or at least I do think it is also very important to try to do things together, as we have been talking about. Because I cannot see the alternative. I mean, I know it's easy to say that we have to work this out together, but what is the alternative? I don't believe in the alternative, to separate too much and things like that. And yes, I have decided to also to try to be hopeful as long as I can. So that's my last thing to say. Yeah.
Yeah, so I've been taken by two strands in this conversation. One, positive and communal and pro-social, and optimistic, and the other one be reflecting on some of the weaknesses of our current system and the potential for them getting worse under strain. You know, when you stretch something, when you bend something, when you put something under strain, maybe the cracks show a little bit more. So yeah, it might all go horribly wrong. You know, it kind of went a bit nasty in 1930s Germany, and the history of colonialism and empire building by European nations at the point of a gunboat hasn't been a great history. So I recognize that. But what the hell are we supposed to do? Are we supposed to sit back and go, well, sod it, life's a bit miserable, human beings can be unpleasant, let's just give up? No, we know what we believe in and we should fight for those values. Are we going to win? Well, at the moment, Donald Trump is more powerful than any of us sitting around this table, and that's just an offense to humanity. But we still know what we believe in, and we should fight for it. If we're successful, great. If we're unsuccessful, at least we've done the right thing. So I guess in a sense, it doesn't matter whether we're right to be optimistic or not. What we should do is push forward with the sort of vision that we have. And incidentally, even in the absence of these sorts of humanitarian, socially informed political and economic decisions, we're still saying the right thing about mental health care within the system that we've inherited. So we can plow forward with that anyway.
Well, I want to say one of my favorite mottos that I've come across is freedom fighters don't always win, but they're always right. And I'm very grateful and quite honored to have shared the screen with all of you freedom fighters and with all of the freedom fighters in the who attended and who I've been seeing so actively engaged in the chat room. So it's quite a pleasure and quite an honor to be a part of this. So thank you all for coming, and I hope the panelists, I hope you'll all stick around for a few minutes to decompress. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you all. It's great stuff. Thank you.